By the time February's coldest night settled over the county and the wind began stripping heat from every exposed surface, the same neighbors who once stood at the edge of Caleb Mercer's property laughing at his grass-covered house would find themselves staring at it like it was the only thing standing between them and real danger. But months earlier, none of them took it seriously. Not when the former Army Ranger first rolled into town with a quiet demeanor, a scar along his jaw, and a plan that didn't look anything like the homes scattered across that stretch of rural Missouri. Caleb hadn't come back from service looking to fit in. He came back because he was tired of noise, tired of unpredictability he couldn't control, and more than anything, tired of depending on systems he had seen fail too many times under pressure. So when he bought that modest 10-acre plot just beyond the last paved road, he already knew exactly what he was going to build, even if nobody else understood it. And from the very beginning, the project looked wrong to outsiders because instead of framing a standard roof and laying down shingles like every other house in the county, Caleb layered his structure with a methodical precision that drew curious stares. First a heavy-duty waterproof membrane, then a drainage layer of gravel and channels, then thick insulation, and finally several feet of compacted soil that he seeded with native grass until the entire roof blended into the land itself. A living surface that changed with the seasons, green in spring, golden in summer, and eventually frosted white in winter, and people noticed. Of course they did, because in a small town nothing stayed private for long, especially not something that looked like a house trying to disappear into the earth. So the comments started early, casual at first, muttered at the gas station or joked about at the hardware store. But they grew sharper as the structure took shape, because to most of them it didn't look innovative. It looked like a mistake waiting to happen. They said the roof would collapse under the first heavy rain, that the soil would leak through, that mold would take over, that he was wasting time and money on something impractical. And Caleb heard all of it without ever responding more than necessary, because explaining it wouldn't have mattered, not to people who had never spent nights in places where survival depended on how well you prepared before things went wrong. And preparation was exactly what this was. Every decision calculated from years of experience in environments where the difference between comfort and crisis could come down to insulation, concealment, or the ability to maintain a stable internal temperature when everything outside turned hostile. So while others focused on appearances, Caleb focused on systems. He installed a wood-burning stove positioned for maximum heat retention, reinforced the interior walls with materials that absorbed and slowly released warmth, and built a partially underground storage space along the north side of the house where temperatures stayed naturally cool year-round, ideal for preserving food without relying on electricity. And he added rainwater collection barrels that fed into a filtration setup simple enough to maintain without outside help, and solar panels mounted low and angled carefully so they wouldn't draw attention or catch excessive wind. Every piece serving a purpose even if it didn't make sense to anyone watching from the outside. And by late autumn, when the grass on his roof had settled into a dense, insulating layer and the structure itself seemed almost invisible against the rolling land, Caleb had already begun quietly preparing for winter in ways that went far beyond what his neighbors considered normal. He stacked firewood in precise rows, not just enough for comfort, but enough for endurance, checked every seal around doors and windows, tested airflow systems, and organized his food stores with the same discipline he once used in the field, because he had learned the hard way that the worst situations weren't always the loudest or most dramatic. Sometimes they were slow, creeping, and underestimated until it was too late. And that was exactly what worried him about the forecast that started trickling in around early December, the kind that most people brushed off because winters were always cold and storms came and went. But Caleb paid attention to the patterns behind the headlines, the shifts in temperature, the unusual timing, the way local reports hinted at something deeper without fully committing to it. And while the town carried on like it always did, holiday lights going up, trucks moving in and out, people assuming the systems they relied on would hold steady, Caleb doubled down on his preparations without saying a word, because he wasn't building that sod roof for looks, and he wasn't stacking supplies out of habit. He was doing it because he recognized something others didn't yet see. And as the first real cold front rolled in, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature that settled into the bones of every structure not built to handle it, The contrast between Caleb's homestead and the rest of the neighborhood began to show in subtle ways. His house holding warmth longer, his systems running quieter and more efficiently, while others adjusted thermostats, listened to furnaces kick on and off, and assumed that would be enough to carry them through, still unaware that the real test hadn't even begun, and that the strange, grass-covered house they laughed at all summer was about to become the one place in the entire area built not just to withstand what was coming, but to outlast it. By the time February settled in, the cold stopped behaving like a passing phase and started feeling like something permanent, pressing down on the town with a kind of steady, unforgiving force that most people weren't ready for, because while January had been harsh, this was different. The temperatures didn't climb during the day anymore. The wind didn't ease, and the snow didn't melt. It just layered over ice and built into something that made even short trips outside feel risky, and at first, people handled it the way they always had, turning up their heat, making extra supply runs, assuming the systems around them would hold. But that assumption didn't last long, because the power grid began failing in sections under the strain, lines snapping under ice, and leaving entire roads without electricity. And when the heat went out, homes started losing warmth faster than anyone expected, the cold creeping in through walls, floors, and windows until it became something you couldn't ignore. And as the outages stretched from hours into days, problems stacked quickly. Pipes froze and burst, food supplies ran low, and backup plans people thought would carry them through a weekend started falling apart under the pressure of something longer, something uncertain. And across the area, families scrambled to adapt, burning through firewood too fast, sealing off rooms, layering clothes, doing whatever they could to hold on to heat while the temperature outside kept dropping. But just beyond all of that, Caleb Mercer's homestead remained steady in a way that didn't match what everyone else was experiencing. The sod roof doing exactly what it was built to do as snow and frozen earth piled on top, creating a natural insulation layer that trapped warmth inside instead of letting it escape, turning his house into a controlled environment where the cold couldn't break through the same way. And inside, the difference was clear. The wood stove burning efficiently without constant effort. The temperature holding stable. The air still breathable and calm while the storm pushed harder outside. And Caleb moved through it all without panic, checking supplies, maintaining his systems, sticking to routines he trusted, because none of this caught him off guard. It was exactly the kind of situation he had built for. And as the days dragged on, that contrast became impossible for the rest of the town to ignore, because while their homes struggled and their resources dwindled, his didn't. And conversations started shifting. The same people who once laughed now watching from a distance, trying to understand how something that looked so unconventional was holding up better than everything else around it. And by the second week, when the cold tightened even further and the roads became nearly impassable, cutting off any remaining sense of outside support, the situation turned from inconvenient to serious. Because food deliveries had stopped completely, store shelves were empty, and no one could say when things would return to normal. And that uncertainty weighed on people just as much as the cold, pushing them into decisions they hadn't planned for. And it was in that stretch, when the nights felt longer, the houses colder, and the options fewer, that the idea of Caleb's place stopped being a joke entirely. Because it was still standing, still warm, still functioning, and for the first time, people began to look at it not with skepticism, but with a quiet, reluctant realization that the one thing they had dismissed all year might be the only thing in the area truly built to handle what February had become. The first knock came late one night when the wind had finally started to die down, but the cold still held its grip. And when Caleb opened the door, he found his nearest neighbor standing there, exhausted, shaking, and out of options after their heat had failed completely. And without hesitation, Caleb stepped aside and let them in, not making a point of it, not saying, "I told you so," just acting the way he always had, direct and practical. And that moment shifted everything, because word travels fast in small communities, especially when survival is involved. And by the next day, others began making their way across the frozen ground toward the one place that still showed signs of stability, some walking, some struggling through the snow, all of them carrying the same quiet realization that the house they once laughed at was now the safest place they could reach. And Caleb didn't turn them away. But he didn't let it become disorder either, quickly organizing the space, assigning simple rules, managing firewood use, and making sure everyone understood how to keep the system working instead of overwhelming it. And inside that sod-covered structure, the difference was undeniable. The temperature stayed steady. The wind couldn't be heard the same way. And for the first time in days, people weren't thinking about how cold they were. They were thinking clearly again, and that clarity brought something else with it. A recognition that what Caleb had built wasn't luck or exaggeration. It was preparation carried out with intention. And over the next several days, as February continued to test everything around them, that homestead held firm, not just as a shelter, but as proof of what foresight actually looks like when it's done right. And when the weather finally began to ease and the roads slowly reopened, the town stepped back and a normal life changed in a way that didn't need to be spoken out loud. Because no one joked about the grass-covered roof anymore. No one questioned why he built it the way he did. And in the weeks that followed, more than a few people started rethinking their own homes, their own assumptions, and their own level of readiness. Because the lesson had already been made clear without Caleb ever having to explain it, that the line between unnecessary and essential isn't decided in comfort. It's decided in moments like February, when the only thing that matters is whether what you build can actually carry you through.